being here today to especially focus on you and to fellowship with your people. We thank you for the KBC family and the marvelous way you've brought us from such varied backgrounds and circumstances, but brought us into your family that we might be a part of the family of God. And we thank you for what Jesus did to make that all possible. As always, we just are overwhelmed with the fact that you were pleased to write a love letter to us. And we have it in the Bible. We have the Bible to study, to read, and the pleasure, the comfort, the safety of our homes, as well as in public. And we ask for special help to interpret it aright, to get hold of what you're trying to drive home to your children as you prepare us for a life with you for eternity. So bless this time, we pray, in Jesus' matchless name. Amen. Okay, this is the KBC Adult Sunday School class, and as you remember, for the months of July and August, for 9 weeks, we are dealing with a study in the book of Proverbs. We're not able, of course, to go verse by verse or anything, but what we're trying to do is the first 2 weeks we tried to set the stage by looking at the first 9 chapters, and even though those first 9 chapters just seem to be very repetitious, etc., remember what Solomon is trying to do. So as I drew this simple chart again, because this is the thought he's trying to get into our mind, because the rest of the book is going to elaborate on it. So he introduces us to the 2 ways. And of course, there are all kinds of synonyms for ways, paths, footsteps, just the direction you're taking, etc. And he pictures for us in about 9 different scenarios, if you will, where this young man, but remember, we're not just talking about a young man, it also deals with young women, and you don't have to be young, because as we know, as we keep developing this, we realize how true this is for anybody, everybody, whatever their age. But you come to this fork in the road, and at this fork in the road, we have 2 ladies, 2 women standing there. One is referred to as Lady Wisdom, the other is Dame Folly, and there's some other synonyms for it, and we'll get into that even more today. And as you come to this fork in the road, you need to make a choice. There are only 2 ways to go in life, 2 paths to follow. And so Lady Wisdom stands there, and she tries to attract followers by saying, "Follow me, because if you follow me, this is where the righteous walk. This is the kind of character they have. This is the kind of people they are. And eventually they will end up with eternal life." And of course, remember, when she presents life here, it's not just eternal life at the end, but it's a whole quality of life that leads to eternal life. But then we also meet Dame Folly here. And Dame Folly is this lady who stands there and she says, "Ah, young man, follow me. Look what I can offer you." And as we said before, and as we'll say again as we continue today, she is, even though most of the things we're talking about here are very sexually charged, if you will, it's not just about sex. It's not just about adultery or about illicit sexual relationships. It's the whole thing of just luring or tempting. And so as we said, basically this, as she presents it, this is the way of the devil. This is the enemy who says, "Follow me. Look at all the enticing things I can offer you." And of course, she doesn't say the wicked people are here or that's what your character will be if you follow. But it always ends by saying her path leads to death. And again, don't think of death as simply, "Oh, well, I'll have a good time, and then when I die, maybe I'll have a deathbed conversion or something so I won't end up here." What the word death is referring to, just like life refers to a whole quality of life, death refers to a whole quality of not walking with God. It refers to a whole quality of being apart from God. And those are the 2 choices that over and over the first 9 chapters keep presenting to us as Solomon is talking to his son. And so he keeps saying, "My son, you are going to come to the fork in the road. You do need to make decisions, but don't be enticed by Dame Folly. Her way is the way of destruction." You don't want to hang around people like that. But, he says, look at Lady Wisdom. She is also right here in the marketplace. In other words, if you want to be wise, if you want to know the Lord, you don't need to go to a school and climb the ivy walls and sit in the famous library, and that's the only way you get wisdom. No, wisdom is also right there at the fork of the road. in the concourse, as we would say, at the intersection where the stoplight is in downtown Main Street. And she too is crying for converts, and that's where every one of us, of course, needs to make the choice. Which choice will I make? Do I want to go the way of the righteous, or do I want to go the way of the wicked? Do I want my character to be formed like Christ, or do I want the devil to be the one who basically calls the shots in my life, and I live for him and serve him? Okay? So that's chapters 1 to 9. Now, in these next 7 weeks, we've already started looking at, and you can see this at the top of your sheet, where we have the various individual topics that we are looking at, that in chapters 10 to 31, that usually to us we look at, and they just seem to be like a lot of one-liners, where you have just, one verse, maybe 2 verses, and it seems like there's no rhyme or reason between them, and they're just hopping all over the place. We'll notice how they predominate in what is called antithetic parallelism, which is simply a Hebrew way of writing poetry, where you have one line that basically says something, and then you have the second line, which is the opposite, or we call it antithetical, because it is the antithesis or the opposite of that it's the opposite of that very thing. And so often it is saying, the righteous man does something, but the wicked person does something. And so it simply is contrasting those who are saved with those who are not saved, and it's talking about their character and character development. And again, remember, this is not saying that if you're saved, every decision you make looks like you are really on this road and it's proper. Even as believers, we sometimes struggle for choosing the wrong thing. And that doesn't mean a person who is actually unsaved, and we would say wicked, as the Bible calls them, it doesn't mean they can never do anything right. But it means the quality of their life and basically the direction they are taking falls under this particular category. And so as we look at these various topics, such as week 1, be teachable, we noticed how that's really the foundation for everything in life. Because if you are not teachable, you are saying, God, get out of my life. I don't need you to tell me how to conduct my affairs. I'm enough of a man or a woman. I can handle life on my own terms. I'm going to do my own thing. And so you have the teachable versus the unteachable. Last week we talked about speech, or lips, or mouth, or communication. And remember, as we said, that deals today with all of our communication, even if it's not with our mouth, even if it's, with our fingers, whether we're texting, emailing, whatever we're doing. And it's saying that godly people know how to use communication. Wicked people have their whole way of using it themselves to advance evil, and the very way that they do it, the very attitudes that they have. And again, you weren't born yesterday. You know what I'm talking about when you read emails from some people, when you read blog posts, when you read things that people post, and it's just like, give me a break. If you want to be that kind of vindictive fool, go ahead and do it, but do it in the privacy of your closet without any electronic communications around. Don't share that with your 2 billion Instagram followers or whatever, okay? But the book of Proverbs is very, very clear in just telling us, communication is very, very important. In fact, there's more information in the book on communication or speech than I think any other subject. And so God must know that that's an area we struggle with, and God knows no matter when you live in history, whether it's 3,000 years ago as an Israelite or whether it's in 21st century America, communication is a big deal, because that's how we communicate. Boy, isn't that a profound sentence? Communication is a big deal. Wait a minute, you can't use synonyms when you describe. Oh, well, forget that. But you get the point. Okay, so at the top you see the topics we're covering. Now, today we come to associations or comparisons. Companions. Our associations are our companions. And since Proverbs already has told us, emphasized there are only 2 ways and 2 kinds of people, now Solomon is going to tell his son, so son, you know what? The kind of people you hang around with is very, very important, because they are going to help shape your character. And if you say that you are really walking this way, but you just love to have all your friends and all your chums over here, that's really telling me something about your heart. because that's saying that maybe you really aren't over on this road after all, and that's why you like to be with that kind of people. You know, what's an expression we use? Birds of a feather flock together. Okay, and that's not just talking about chickens or crows or whatever. Okay, it's reminding us of how important it is to hang around with the right kind of people. So the first question I put there on your sheet, see if you could think of any off the cuff. What proverbial expressions do we have concerning this subject of the importance of associations or the importance of our companions? I already listed one there. A person is known by the company he keeps. Birds of a feather flock together. Can you think of any just offhand real quickly? Any come to mind? Dan's drawing a blank, but anybody think of any? Hanging out with the wrong crowd. Okay, I had that on my sheet, but I guess I didn't. Did I put that there? Yeah, I put it there. Okay. Maynard can read. Good. We're glad that Maynard can read. Any others you immediately think of? I meant to look in a book I had that gives cliches and expressions in the English language, and I ran out of time. But okay, well, you see what we're talking about. So you are the company you keep. There's something close to that. Yeah, we'll give Laura credit for that. You can have an extra dessert today. Okay, so that's what we're talking about. Now, before we actually get to Proverbs, I want to step out of the book of Proverbs for two quick verses that are very, very clear on this, that are very familiar to us. The first one there on your sheet is Psalm 1 and verse 1. Oh, the blessedness, says, of the man who walks not in the counsel of the ungodly, nor stands in the way of sinners, nor sits in the seat of the scornful. But the positive, his delight is in the law of the Lord, and in his law doth he meditate day and night. Okay, so these two verses right at the beginning of the book of Psalms show us in a very profound and yet simple way how important this distinction is. Because it says, oh, the blessednesses of the man, and this man who is blessed by God is somebody who negatively does not do certain things, and positively he does certain things. The positive is he delights in the law of God, and we won't get off on that. That's not our subject for today. But in other words, he delights in being over here and fellowshipping with God and his word. But what does he need to do negatively? Well, he needs to dissociate himself from certain kinds of people. And so notice what it says. See, did I put the quote on your sheet? Yes, the man whose life is blessed by God is known for both the negative and positive. God freely blesses, but it must be promoted by two kinds of activities: dissociation from the wicked and association with God. Okay? And so, there are here, and I tried to lay it out as such so you could see that what appears to be a progression in these terms that he uses. He says, first of all, blessed is the person who does not walk. And then he intensifies it a little bit. He also does not stand, and finally, he does not sit. Okay? So we're seeing progression. So on the one hand, here is simply somebody who is, shall we say, just walking along, and he says, I really don't want to constantly be in the company of that kind of person. Or it continues, and he says, but you need to be careful because, wait a minute, all of a sudden, instead of just walking along, you can just stand and say, you know what? I want to take my stand here because I love being around people like that. And finally, he says, you know what? I am so convinced that those are the kind of people that I really love, I'm going to just sit here. I'm going to permanently place myself in their midst. And he says, no, the blessed man doesn't do any of those. He realizes how easy it is if you just start walking with them consistently. It's not going to be long for you to just want to stop and hang out with them. And before you know it, you're going to say, you know what, there might not be all that much difference between us. They're humans and I'm a human. At least I think so. And so therefore, I'm going to just camp out, if you will, with them. And he says, no. Then he continues and he says, they do not stand or they do not walk in the counsel. That's simply a word for advice. In other words, their chief thought is they don't go to the ungodly people and say, hey, what would you do in this key critical moment that I have in my life? Or he says they don't stand in the way and ultimately they do not sit in the seat. And finally, he says, notice the progression, they do not walk in the advice of the ungodly, they do not stand in the way of sinners, or they do not sit in the seat of scorners. And as you see on your sheet, in parentheses, it says that's the number 5 fool. If you haven't been with us before, remember earlier in our lessons, we spent some time and I gave you a sheet on the 5 classes of fools that the Old Testament refers to, where you start off with, shall we say, the simple fool, the person who basically is naive, they've been untaught, they've just not had someone pour good instruction into them, and it keeps progressing until you get to the number 5 fool, which the Bible usually uses the word scorners. And a scorner is somebody who's dead set, his fist, if you will, is in God's face, saying, God, get out of my life. What would you have to do with life? I don't need you. I'm a self-made individual. I can get along well in life. And of course, the ultimate comeback by God is Proverbs 3:34, God scorns the scorners. In other words, in effect, God tells the scorner, you don't need me, I don't need you. And I think I referred to before where it was C.S. Lewis who said, God is enough of a gentleman that if a person just consistently keeps telling God, get out of my life, I don't need you, the point comes where God says, have it your way, go to hell, I will get out of your life. Okay? So, this is serious stuff we're talking about when he says the companions we choose it's very, very serious, because we can, if we're not careful, start becoming exactly like them. And then in the other verses, 1 Corinthians 15:33, that I put on your sheet there, in the King James Version it reads, be not deceived, evil communications corrupt good manners. And by the way, that actually is a quote from a pagan writer, Menander. That doesn't mean that everything that Menander said was gospel truth or was inspired. It just so happens that that phrase came to Paul's mind, and that is a true statement. And so he used something that even a pagan said because it's true. But maybe when you read the King James, if that's the translation you're reading, you're saying, wait a minute, what does that have to do with companions? So actually, I gave you a couple of more modern translations or a paraphrase where it really gets to the point, because the Greek word used there is not for communications, it is for your company or the kind of people you hang around with. So the Message says, don't fool yourselves, bad company ruins good manners. Or God's Word translation, don't let anybody deceive you, associating with bad people will ruin decent people. And that is exactly what our whole thrust is for our emphasis in Proverbs today. It's when you start associating with bad people. And as we're going to see, that doesn't mean you can't witness to unsaved people. This has nothing to do with evangelism. How else are you going to reach unsaved people if you don't talk to them? But we're talking about spending time with them in the sense of saying, but I love to be with them. I want them to be my closest friends. I just want to be where they are. I want to go and do what they do. That is where the Solomon here is telling his son, you've got to choose your friends better than that, because the friends you choose are going to have a profound impact on your lifestyle. So, what we're doing again here is we've done in past weeks. On the left-hand side, I've simply given to you some verses through Proverbs, and we'll just try and walk through them very quickly, and you're probably going to have to do a good bit of digging out on your own. But let's start off with two very foundational verses in Proverbs that drive home our point here of the importance of companionship or friendship. Okay, the first one is chapter 13 and verse 20. He that walks with wise men shall be wise, but a companion of fools, that's a number 3 fool, shall suffer harm. Okay? So the person who walks with wise people is wise, but a person who wants to get mixed up with or associate with fools, then there will be consequences for that. And there's actually, in the Hebrew here, a word on the play companion and suffer harm. And so on your sheet there, I gave you the Knox translation, where Knox translates it, fool he ends, that fool befriends. So that sounds like a nice little cliche to remember, right? Fool he ends, who fool befriends. And that's That's the simple point that is being made here. And so the quote on your sheet under 1320 is simply, the difference between wisdom and foolishness rests not merely upon formal training, but also upon the informal relationships of life. Wisdom and foolishness are not simply taught, but caught. For this reason, one must guard carefully who influences him. Okay? So this goes back to even the thought of Psalm 1 and verse 1, when it talks about just walking in the company of these people. It's not just a matter of, you say, well, I don't sit there for 4 hours a day and watch these videos or listen to this. No, it's just people I hang out with. Well, that's the whole point. Even when an ungodly person is not saying something, he can be communicating stuff to you. He can be leading you down the wrong path, and you can catch that ungodliness. Chapter 14 and verse 7, the next verse, go from the presence of a foolish man. That's our number 3 fool, going back to your chart. When you perceive not in him the lips of knowledge. Okay? So remember that knowledge is a synonym or is a facet of wisdom. So it is simply reminding us here that why would you want to spend your time in the presence of somebody who is a fool? In other words, who is an anti-wise person, who is an anti-knowledge person. Why would you say, I love wisdom, but I love to be around people who aren't wise? I love knowledge, but I love to be around people who don't have knowledge. Doesn't make any sense. And so he simply says, son, you need to remember, following the quote, Proverbs emphasizes the significance of choosing wisely one's friends. Here, Solomon demands that one waste no time in the presence of a fool. Don't debate it, don't prolong it, leave. Only those who provide or reinforce the ways of wisdom are worthy of our intimate relationships. Now here, reminder, this is not a proverb about evangelism, but about who becomes our confidant. We must guard carefully who influences us. Okay? And I might add here, remember, this has to do with like our reading material and our viewing material. Maybe you say, well, Royce, I am kind of antisocial, so you don't need to worry that I'm going to spend a lot of time with ungodly people. So what do you do? Well, I sit at home 6 hours a day and watch TV and listen to these ungodly people talk. Oh, and then I also have reading material where I'm just feeding my mind with all this anti-God stuff. Well, that's a violation of this as well. You don't need to be walking with a literal person to be the companion of them. The things that we choose every day to influence us are our companions. And sorry to say, again, with all this tremendous electronic stuff we have today, it is so easy to simply get into that, and before you know it, and we're going to see some verses that I think pretty directly, shall we say, deal with that. Before you know it, we just start getting so hot under the collar and so mad about stuff. And it's, well, no wonder we're spending too much time with the wrong people. We need to be spending time with the right kind of input. And I might add, maybe we look at these 2 verses that we just said, 13:20 and 14:7, and we say, this is pretty strong stuff for God to say you shouldn't want to be with them and they will affect you. And I thought, you know what, just think of this recent COVID crisis. Just think what that was all about. Quarantine, 6 feet between you, etc., because people can be contagious. They can pass things along to you. And yet, how many times do we think of that spiritually with the crowd that we hang out with and say, you know what, if I hang out with them, they're contagious. They're going to pass along some kind of spiritual germs. I've got to be very, very careful. Laura? Okay, Laura brings up a great question. Like if you have an unsafe parent, let's say, very negative, etc., and you're supposed to honor them, how can you spend much time with them? How can you honor them and also keep what the verse says? Any other questions before we move on quickly? Yeah, that is a $1 million question, and that's a razor's edge. That's a razor's edge because it can be easy to fall off either side or get cut if you try and straddle it. But I would say on the one hand, you have to kind of be judicious, where you simply say, okay, what does it mean to honor my parent, and how can I do that? But at the same time, I need to try and make sure that shall we say, the negativity, the evil stuff, I don't just start enjoying myself or just saying, well, hey, maybe it's not all that bad. Or I know, at least with myself, after bad experiences, if we're not careful, we can keep repeating it in our minds and, shall we say, writing it and rewriting it on our hard drive, if you will. And before long, then, it's kind of there, and whenever something happens, it just pops up automatically, even though we didn't want it to. And so I think probably a good thing is to just try and do your best to, with our expression, like water off a duck's back, if you will, not let it get more than skin deep, and just not keep rehearsing it in our minds, so that then it just keeps popping up. But that's like I say, that's a $1 million question. That's not easy. Not easy. Yeah, establishing boundaries. Yeah, that can help. Okay, the next verse on your sheet is chapter 20 and verse 19. And beginning here now in the bold letters, the capital letters to start with, I have kind of put a summation of the kind of person that the verse talks about, that we need to be very, very careful and avoid making them our companions. So, for example, chapter 20 and verse 19 is dealing with a slanderer, or somebody who is loose-lipped. Okay? It says he goes about as a talebearer, revealing secrets, so don't meddle, that is, don't have fellowship with, don't get involved with that kind of person who flatters with his lips. The New American Standard uses the word gossip here, so I think that can also be a good way to look at it. And the Hebrew is a little bit confusing, but literally it says, beware of the person who opens wide his lips. And so the thought seems to be loose-lipped. That's where I get this expression here, loose-lipped. And as I put on your sheet, it can be juicy to listen to people who are always gossiping and slandering and say, yeah, I hate the person they're gossiping about. I hate them as much as they do. I hope they pour it on. And wait a minute. That can be juicy to listen to that stuff, but is that the kind of stuff you should fill your mind with? Absolutely not. For your own sake, you shouldn't be doing it. But also, no telling how you could maybe help that other person and say, you know what, if you want to think those thoughts about that person, I have no control over your thought life, but it's not right. It's not right for you to be giving that kind of juicy stuff in public. In 24 to 25, the kind of companion you want to beware of would be those who lack self-control over their feelings. In other words, they're hot-tempered. So it says, make no friendship. That is, don't make companionship with an angry man. This is also a very interesting Hebrew expression to emphasize a certain thing. It says this man is an owner of the nose, or he's an owner of anger. In other words, his whole character is simply when you think of that person, the first thing you think about is he's an angry man, she's an angry woman. And it doesn't mean they're angry 24/7. It simply means that's the character that dominates the character trait that dominates their life. And therefore, he says, you want to be very, very careful of being around that kind of people. The quote I put on your sheet, this signifies a hothead of the highest degree. As one writer says, this individual is the poster boy for those who are hot under the collar. In other words, you don't want to hang out with people like that, because before you know it, you're going to soon start being just as hot-tempered and lack self-control. I gave you there Psalm, let's see, I think I did. No, I didn't, but Psalm 106, 34 to 36. Let me quickly read those verses. This is in a historical psalm referring to the children of Israel, where God had told them that when they go into the promised land, they were supposed to treat the Canaanites a certain way, because if they didn't, those Canaanites would have incredible influence on them. So in Psalm 106, 33, verse 34, It says, they did not destroy the nations concerning whom the Lord commanded them, but were mingled among the heathen and learned their works, and they served their idols, which were a snare unto them. And that's exactly what this verse tells us in 22, 24, and 25. That kind of person will be a snare to you. You might think that you can get control over it, but you can't. It is a trap. It is a trap the devil's going to use to get you. In 23:17, let not your heart envy sinners, but be in the fear of the Lord all day long. Okay? And this word translated envy here is going to recur over and over in these verses that we're talking about today, which makes me believe God knows this is an area that we really struggle with. In other words, it's an area we need to really combat in our own lives. So he says, let not your heart envy. That's a word for don't get heated up when you look at, the category here is sinners. Now, as I put on your sheet here, see, didn't I put it on your sheet? Yes. I put note the NIV translation, because in the King James, if you look at the English there, it has in like a different print, it has like in quotation marks the word be in the fear of the Lord. And you say, well, how does that go along with this? So in other words, the second half of this proverb has no verb to it. So writers simply wrestle with it and say, well, what does the second half of the verb of the verse mean? How does it tie into the first? Probably the way Hebrew poetry works, we're supposed to take the verb from the first part and also repeat it in the second part. And that's exactly what the NIV does. Don't let your heart envy sinners, but be always zealous for the fear of the Lord. And this Hebrew word translated envy can also mean to be jealous or to be zealous for something. So in other words, it's saying don't be jealous of wicked people and say, wow, they seem to get a good shake in life and everything they do turns to gold, and here I am trying to serve God and I'm not prospering. He says, no, don't be jealous of them. He says, be jealous for the fear of God. And we won't go into detail on what the fear of God means here, since we have in a previous class. But in a nutshell, it simply means your relationship with God, your sold outness to Him, your dedication to Him. So he says, instead of being jealous and getting all hot about them and thinking they're getting something that they don't deserve, you just cultivate your fear of God, and God will bless you as you can't imagine. 23:20 to 21. The company of sinners to stay away from are those who lack self-control and inner discipline. So be not among wine bibbers, in other words, those who drink largely. Don't be among riotous eaters of the flesh, or as New American Standard says, gluttonous eaters of meat. And actually, the Hebrew adds a word here, and I'm not sure why English translations have just kind of erased it, but it says, don't be among wine bibbers, nor among riotous eaters of the flesh, for themselves. It seems almost like an added word thrown in there, but the point seems to be these two qualities of people, those who are excessive in their alcoholic habits, and we could add drugs today, etc. These who are excessive in their gluttony do it all for themselves. It's all about me. Why do I get drunk? Why do I get high on drugs? Why do I just constantly feed myself, etc.? It's because life is all about me. I'm the most important person. And so he is saying here in verse 21, he gives the motive or the reason why not to associate with them. This kind of person comes to poverty. Drowsiness clothes a man with rags. In other words, because these problems are so self-centered and so self-indulgent, what happens? Oftentimes when a person starts giving himself over to them, it leads to indolence, it leads to poverty, it leads to all kinds of problems. And if you don't think this verse is a living reality today, will you go with me to a rescue mission, and will you talk to the people who are there? A lot of them will tell you the kinds of careers they've had, the kinds of jobs they had, the great family and children they had. I remember when I was pastor here back in the 80s and 90s and would go multiple times monthly to the Ogden Rescue Mission for a morning Bible study. And I got to know these guys because they were committing themselves because they knew they needed help for constant overcoming of problems. And there were people who were there who graduated from Notre Dame, graduated from Stanford, graduated from business schools. I mean, they had all kinds of stuff going for them. And then all of a sudden they just said, well, you know what? Life's a little hard. I'm going to just start tipping the bottle a little more. And all of a sudden they lose their job, and then they lose their family, and then they lose everything, and they just hit the streets. And if you read the Ogden or the Salt Lake Rescue Mission updates today, virtually every week they focus on a man or a woman who's trying to get their life together. And just about every one of them, it comes back to this kind of thing. No self-control, and before you know it, as we say, the dominoes start falling. One thing leads to another, and look where they are. And the writer of Proverbs says, young man, Solomon tells his son, young man, you want to be careful who you hang out with. Because if you hang out with the wrong kind of people, you can begin to think those little things don't matter. Okay? Then we come to chapter 24, verses 1 and 2. This would be habitual evildoers are not supposed to be our companions. We have a repetition of the word, be not envious, don't be zealous against evil men, neither desire or crave to be with them. And then verse 2 gives the reason or the motive, and it seems basically that it's saying, it says their heart studies or meditates on destruction, their lips talk of mischief, and so the point seems to be that somebody might want to chum up with them because of the payoff that it will afford. And they say, well, look at that person who's a little bit iffy on business deals, a little bit, I don't know, on this or that. But look at the payoff they seem to get. I mean, wow, in this market, they're making money hand over fist. And Solomon says, watch out, my son, watch out. Because the payoff that they're going to get is not the kind of payoff you want. 24, 19 to 20, unsaved people generally. Fret not thyself. This is a different word, but it means don't get heated up in vexation because of evil men. Neither be envious, that's our word jealousy or envy, at the wicked, for there shall be no reward. That is, there is no future to the evil man. His lamp will be put out. And his lamp or his light is a metaphor for his life. And it's simply saying he will come to the end of life, and it will be a hopeless eternity that he will meet. So the quote I put on your sheet, the attitude which says, I serve God faithfully and get nothing, but look at those who give no care to God's ways, is simply a toxic combination of anger, probably at God, as well as envy of the wicked's apparent blessing. And I think God seems to, or Solomon seems to keep repeating this over and over in these passages today, because he knows how easy it is for us, even though we might never express it publicly, how easy it is within us to say, well, look at that unsaved person. They seem to be making so much money. Look at that athlete. Look at that star. Look at that hedge fund guy. And before long, it's like, wow, if I just had, look how they're blessed, and here I am trying to be faithful to God and raise my family and have a testimony for the Lord. And wait a minute. There's more than meets the eye, okay? We need to be very, very careful that we don't develop this attitude of envy. 24:21. It says, this could be one for rebels to authority, okay? The first part of the verse simply says, fear God and the king, meddle not, that is, don't get involved with or have fellowship or mix up with those who are given to change. So again, the question is, how do both halves of this verse go together? Okay? The first part, fear God and the king, seems to be referring to the attitude we are supposed to have toward authority. Remember the classic New Testament passage, Romans 13, 1-7, where it says, God has appointed governmental officials over us, and even when you disagree with them, you need to show them the kind of respect for somebody who has been put in that position by God, or else you're sinning against God. And granted, if you live in certain countries in the world today, that would really be hard to do. Of course, it's getting more that way in America, huh? But there is this pecking order of authority that God has established. So fear God and fear the king, because God put him in authority to do certain things. But, he says, then don't meddle with those who are given to change. And it's kind of a difficult expression, but it seems to be saying, don't hang out with those people who want to violate those levels of authority. In other words, rebels. And wow, as I was reading this, scenes came to my mind, pictures came to my mind from, a year ago? Maybe it's 2 years ago now. Time goes in a hurry when you're old and having fun. But yeah, all those riots that were taking place. And you say, how many people that were involved in that kind of stuff really knew what they were doing, and they had done their homework and written a paper on it so they understood what's going on? Nah. They were just caught up in the fervor of it all. Hey, a night on the town. We can do a lot of stuff tonight and get away with it. We could never get away with it. We tried to do it individually because we'd get caught for vandalism, who knows what, but not now. And Solomon is simply telling his son, watch out. Watch out. Understand what God says about authority. Don't get mixed up with those who are rebels against authority. And as I put on my sheet here, I don't think I wrote it on yours, the time, the place, and manner of civil disobedience is razor thin. Okay? And that's a whole other topic for a rainy day or a sunny day, whatever, concerning civil disobedience. But just to say, well, the government isn't doing what I think it should do, so I have a right to disobey it. Life's not quite that simple, okay? 28:7, watch out if you hang around those who mock God's law. Whoso keepeth the law is a wise son. He that is a companion, he gets associated with or mixed up with riotous men, shames his father. So the emphasis here seems to be on someone who is just thoughtless or rash. He treats something lightly. And since the first part of the verse talked about obeying the law, keeping the law, dedicated to the law, it seems that it's referring to those who are mockers of God's law. And this verse adds the interesting comment that the kind of companions a child has can humiliate the parents because of the choices the child made. And boy, I can give you some illustrations from when I was a boy growing up in northwestern Ohio, in a little town. Most of you know my father was a businessman, owned 2 businesses, and in small town atmosphere, 4,000 people or so, everybody knows everybody, and the nature of his businesses, funeral home and furniture store, meant that he knew everybody and everybody knew him. And as I've told you many times, one of the greatest fears I had in life, even though my dad never told me, no, Royce, don't you dare besmirch the Short family name. I never remember my dad saying anything similar to that. But he so lived and so had, and shall I say, God so put his fear in me, that the worst thing I could have done as a boy growing up was to do something that would have made people say, when Bob Short sat around the coffee table at the local Greasy Spoon, hey, did you hear what Bob Short's son did last night? That would have killed me. That would have killed me. And I could give you illustrations, since we're live and people could pull this up. I won't use anybody's name, but I could give you illustrations of classmates I had who besmirched their family name because of things that they did, and everybody said, oh, I had no idea that pastor's kid would vandalize the school. I had no idea this individual who's an uppity person in a big business would do that kind of thing. But it happens. And so Solomon is saying here, now, son, almost sounds self-serving, doesn't it? But he says, son, watch out for your companions, because the people you hang out with can get you to do things that are going to make me look bad. You're going to drag our family name in the dirt. 29:3, illicit sexual relationships. Whoso loveth wisdom rejoices his father, but he that keeps company or gets mixed up with or associated with harlots spends his wealth. Again, we might simply say improper sexual activity isn't as glamorous as it appears, but it wastes your wealth. 29:24, an accomplice to a thief. This could actually be known criminal behavior. Whoever is a partner who shares with a thief hates his own life. He hears cursing and bewrayeth it not. Whereas the New American Standard Version says he hears the oath, but he doesn't say anything. Okay, what in the world does that mean? What's going on here? Well, this is synthetic parallelism, where the second line isn't opposite the first line. The second line, if you will, adds to the first line. And so the point that seems to be made here is referring to like Leviticus chapter 5 and verse 1, where there was a criminal case and they couldn't find the criminal. They didn't have enough evidence to know who really did this. So the point was that the town leaders, in effect, would pronounce a curse on anybody who had evidence or knew who really did that, and would simply say, you step forward and you testify. And you say, well, you know what? I know who did it, but he's my friend, my coworker, my whatever. I'm not going to testify. And so what it's saying here is, don't hang around people like that who are accomplices to evil. You simply, you start hanging around with that crowd, and it's like you're going to start being that kind of person. You're going to be involved with evil, and you're going to know a lot of things, but you're not going to be willing to talk about it. You're not going to be willing to go to authorities and say, yeah, I know who committed that murder. I know who broke into that store last night. He says no. He says, don't hang around that kind of people. And then finally, we need to really hasten here, but for these verses at the very bottom, chapter 16, verses 27, 28, and 29, seem to be a very tightly knit paragraph dealing with the kind of people, again, to stay away from. And it seems like, without stretching it too much, that the end of verse 29 is basically referring to all these four kinds of people when it says you don't want to hang around them because they lead you into a way that is not good. So the four categories here, the first three are actually dealing with the tongue. Stay away from an ungodly man. And again, the Hebrew grammar here is just amazing because it presents it in a way, it says it using a certain formula, if you will, where it really emphasizes the quality. So it says, stay away from a man whose quality is Belial. And you say, what in the world does Belial mean? Well, I've given you on the sheet some possibilities. Again, this is a kind of a difficult Old Testament expression. Various writers see it different ways. It could simply mean somebody who is without value, without profit, because there is a Hebrew word profit, and then you have the negative on the front of it. So he is a man who has no value or profit. He's worthless. There are others who say, no, this actually refers to a son of perdition, or our expression today would be he's a real hellraiser. Or, because in the New Testament, Belial actually becomes a personal name for the devil, there are some who say this is a son of Satan. In other words, he is evil personified. He is Satan personified. Well, whatever the case might be, it simply says, stay away from that kind of person. In 1628, stay away from an upside-down man. You say, that's a weird English expression. I know, but maybe you'll remember it that way. Again, it's the grammar simply is stay away from a man who always turns everything upside down or is perverse, who's known for his perversity. Then stay away from a slanderer or a gossip, because he separates even intimate friends. And then stay away from a violent man. And this is a word that simply is, the major quality of his life is he is a man, and the quality that defines him is his violence. In other words, whenever you hear his name, it's like, wow, that guy is so violent. Again, it doesn't mean he's 24/7 violent, but it means that's the chief characteristic of his life you can't get out of your head. And he says, stay away from that kind of people. Okay? So, when you put all these things together, you can simply walk down that left-hand side and look at those words that are in all caps and see just how all-encompassing, if you will, it is when Solomon says, you've got to be very careful, son, with the kinds of friends that you make. Because if you start hanging out too much with this kind of people, it is going to make a radical difference in your life. Now, on the flip side of your handout, on the top left side, I gave you a little graphic, and you might say, well, that's kind of weird. What are you talking about? Well, I'm going to read you a little bit of a story here, or a little bit of a ditty, if you will, that you can follow along. And the point that this writer makes when he came up with this is, notice how easy it is. He starts with the word white, but notice how in about 11 easy steps you get to the word black, and you do it with only changing one letter at a time. So in other words, he's going to say, you're always 4/5 purity, but notice how the context changes as you keep walking through here. And I've used this illustration multiple times as a reminder of what I simply call the slide. In other words, how easy it is when you start having the wrong companions to say, well, it's really not that big a deal, Dad. And all of a sudden, next thing you know, it goes to the next level, and the next level, and the next level. And all of a sudden, you've gone from white to black in all these easy steps. And as I put on your sheet, usually they're justifiable. Usually they're very, very unnoticeable, if you will. And yet they are very, very significant. Let me illustrate it this way. From, again, my boyhood, used to like to go to the park where they had slippery slides, and in those days, slippery slides were made out of stuff, so you really did slide down them, okay? They didn't worry about OSHA regulations, and they were pretty steep. And so as boys, with my brothers, we would take wax paper. Did you ever sit on wax paper on a real slippery slide? You know how fast you can go? And one of the things you might try as you're going down, when you shoved off, you would say, okay, and you'd look at a spot about a third of the way down and say, when I get there, I'm going to grab the side of that slippery slide and I'm going to stop on a dime. Oh, yeah, right. Because the farther you go, the faster you go, and the faster you go, the more you're going to be shooting out of there. And sure enough, you'd come to the end and you would just zoop right off, and maybe you landed on your tailbone, but there was nobody to sue for it. You were having too much fun. Okay? And that's exactly the way it is when it comes to this. This is a slippery slide. You think, well, I can get hold of it. I'm enough of a man or woman. I can put a stop to this anytime I want. No, we can't. No, we can't. And so the story goes like this. The New Testament church began as the final E of the pure white milk of the gospel. And here the writer is playing on this. He's saying the New Testament church began as the final E because the Greek word for church is ekklesia. In other words, it begins with an epsilon. So that's his starting point. The New Testament church began as the final E of the pure white milk of the gospel. That lasted for a while. Now notice there's only one letter change. But then the church chose to go for the whole, one letter change, rather than be content with a holy remnant. Of course, this was to dally with the great whore, one letter change, yet it was argued the E was being preserved. So you see the point? While the person is going down this slippery slide, they're saying, but hey, the word whore has an E at the end, so surely we're still part of the church. Still, this is okay to God. Now, let's see. And so the church began, so the church grew, spreading from shore to shore, intent that every shire be dominated by a church spire. From this institutional base, the church offered its gospel as the spice of life for the world, if in turn it got its slice of the world's pie. In the process, it became slick in the ways of the world and slack in the ways of faith, without even noticing the E had disappeared. Oh, the E is now gone. Now it's a K. Now, white had become black, but where had the transposition taken place? Surely it was necessary that changes occur. They were all logical and orderly. At every step, there were 4 parts of fidelity for every part of change, and 80% isn't a bad proportion. So it can be argued that the resultant black is an honest adaptation of the original white. It's actually a man named Bernard Eller who wrote a book. This is 50 years or so ago, had it in the book. Now you see how profound that really is and how easy the slide can become if we are not careful. One thing leads to another thing that leads to another thing, and you can justify basically every one until we get to the point we don't even realize that we've totally walked away from Christian moorings. Well, we have about 5 or 6 minutes to do the rest of this sheet, so fasten your seat belts, hang on, I'll talk fast, you listen fast. We'll see what we can get done here. So, the last question we have is, finally, who are the varied evil people we meet in chapters 1 to 9, especially Dame Folly, and how are we to interpret her and them? In other words, what does Dame Folly, or who is Dame Folly representative of, and so on. And so I've given you some so-called scholarly options. There are some who say, well, because the word strange woman or foreign woman, that's actually a word that can be used for a non-Israelite. So they say, well, she's actually a foreigner who's devoted to a foreign goddess, and she's trying to get this Israelite boy to follow her foreign gods. Others say it's just a picture from epic literature, because all throughout epic literature we have stories of these beautiful women who try to seduce these innocent young men. Others say it's actually dealing with the issue of marriage to foreign women in post-exilic Judah. Because when the Jews came back from captivity, if you remember, the books of Ezra and Nehemiah and Malachi talk about how they had a major problem intermarrying with strange women, that is, foreign women who were not Jews. Others say the most obvious background here is the age-old temptation to adultery. Well, I think the best interpretation is capital E, and this is what in the past I've been teaching this and referred to it at the beginning of this hour. She is actually a representation of folly in all its forms, and thus is an anti-wisdom. In other words, this strange woman, Dame Folly, these evil people are the people who inhabit this way, that way right there, because they are all anti-wisdom. They are all going the opposite way as that. And so as your quote says there, this woman represents, there is more at issue in these passages than to speak of the strange or foolish woman than just the specific sin of adultery. This woman represents a whole attitude to life, just as Lady Wisdom represents a whole attitude toward life. And then another quote, the personification of foolishness as a prostitute is analogous to the prophetic description of the nation as whoring after foreign gods. And you remember how in the Old Testament the prophets would constantly tell the people that. Stop whoring, stop committing adultery. And sometimes it had to do with literal whoring, literal going after illicit sex, because that's what Canaanite religion was all about. But also there was the spiritual level, because anytime you turned from Yahweh, the true God, you were actually bringing a third party into the bedroom. You were bringing in an idol. You were bringing in anti-God, if you will. And therefore, when I also ask the question, what about the secondary enemies, sinners, evil men, wicked men, a man of Belial? They all follow the same path as Dame Folly, and they're all variations of the same theme. And so, in bold, I put there what this is all about is choosing the difference between wisdom and folly, because the choice is between the Lord or idolatry. And that's exactly the choice every one of us has to make today. It's, do I want to follow the Lord? Do I want to become a Christian, in our terms we would use, or do I want to be an anti-Christian? Do I want to say, I want to follow the way of life, which is the way of the devil? So, hopefully you can see how significant, again, chapters 1 to 9 are in laying the foundation, and then as we start looking at all these individual verses, how it's just constantly going back there and constantly driving home. There are only two ways, there are only two choices, there are only two characters that are being formed, there are only two destinies, two places people are going to end up. And you have to choose which one that you really want. And so I gave you a chart, and you're going to have to look at this on your own more. But I gave you columns where you have the anti-wisdom figure in the left-hand column. You have the lures, or you have the devil's methods as he tries to lure people. You have what my response should be. And then you have the final where it's the path that leads to, if I follow this path of Dame Folly, what is it going to ultimately produce? What is my reward? So, as I put at the very bottom, as we conclude on a positive note, remember, this is not about me working my way to heaven. This isn't saying, well, Royce, if you're a good little boy and you just hang out with the right crowd, it guarantees you're going to heaven. No, you don't work your way to heaven, okay? It's simply by trusting the finished work of Jesus Christ and appropriating by faith what he has done. But, as I've been trying to stress throughout this whole series, the book of Proverbs is all about sanctification. Because remember, after you make this choice right here to come to the Lord, Until you die or the Lord returns for you, you are being sanctified. The Holy Spirit is at work in your life on a daily basis to conform you to the image of Jesus Christ. And that's exactly what Solomon is telling his son. Son, choose the right thing. And then as you choose the right thing, God will work in your life to make you this kind of person. So you say the right things so that you're teachable, so you hang out with the right crowd, and we'll keep walking through these various themes in our study. Okay, our time is up today. A lot of material here, but that'll give you something to think about this week if you can't sleep, or maybe it'll put you to sleep. Questions, comments, corrections, additions, deletions as we close. Okay, Lord bless. You've got about 29 minutes until the morning service begins.